cannot support that. Kia ora tātou katoa.
Grant Robertson.
Sure, the Minister will, in fact, appropriately come after me because I've got some questions for him. I want to focus my intervention here on Clause 37, especially around the question of the national, the artist formerly known as the National Planning Template, now called National Planning Standards. But before I do, Mr Chair, I've got a specific question around SOP number 281 in the name of Marama Fox, which has been debated a number of times already in the committee. This is the deal, as it were, to make sure that the rules around regulations that prohibit or remove certain rules do not apply to rules or types of rules that regulate the growing of crops that are genetically modified organisms. And I just want to be clear on the definition of the word crop as to whether or not that actually includes, thank you very much, whether or not that actually includes ryegrasses, pine trees, for instance. Are they crops? Certainly around pine trees, I know that would be one of the concerns that was being raised when this matter was put forward. The definition of the word crops are a little hard to find. Marama Fox has just arrived in the... Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but Marama Fox might now be able to respond to me. I'm just looking for some assistance from the member for her SOP number 281, perhaps through the Minister, as to what the definition of the word crop is, and whether or not that does include things like certain types of grasses, ryegrass, or particularly pine trees. I do note, Mr Chair, that in a quick search of other legislative definitions of the word crop, I have come across one in a regulatory bill from 1999, which says crops means crops whether matured or otherwise, or whether naturally grown or planted, attached to land by roots, or forming part of trees or plants attached to land. And then it says, but does not include trees or pasture. So that's actually, but I think that's quite an interesting clause because it specifically excludes trees from the definition of crops. So if the intention of Marama Fox in SOP number 281 has been to cover GMOs generally in the environment, I think we've clarified a little bit today that we're not talking about GMOs in the lab. Good. But now we are talking about excluding crops here. And I, for one, looking at this SOP, want to be sure, A, that we know what we're voting for, but B, that it meets the concerns of the groups who have been advocating for this. And as I say, I know from previous work in this space, GM pine trees is definitely one of the issues that has been put out there. And ryegrass as well, Mr Parker, that's right. So I'm sure the Minister, the officials, or the member who's drafted the SOP will be able to help us with that definition of the word crops, lest we be misleading members of the public as to the extent of the exclusion for GMOs within those plans. Mr Chair, to return now to Clause 37, as I said, the artist formerly known as the National Planning Template, now called a National Planning Standard. And Mr Chair, in the submission process, nearly the majority of submitters actually supported the concept of a planning template. And that's understandable because that kind of guidance is actually useful and important. But the concern that submitters raised throughout the process, having got their heads around the idea that there would be a template, 77% of submitters actually had problems with its implementation. And the Select Committee clearly gave quite significant consideration to this and basically tore apart Clause 37, put some other bits in. But I don't think they've solved two of the fundamental problems, which I want to talk about now, and perhaps the Minister can help me, enlighten me on this. I now want to refer particularly to what is now 58C3, which talks about what a national planning standard may do, and it may specify the structure and form of regional policy statements and plans. Absolutely fine. 3B, direct local authorities to use a particular structure or form for regional policy statements and plans. And here we start again, Mr Chair, to get into the overreach of the Minister. We talked about this earlier on in Clause 105, that the regulatory power was going too far. Here we've got moving beyond what's a template to actually the content of that template. We then go to 58C3B2, direct local authorities to include specific provisions in their policy statements and plans. That's not a template anymore, Mr Chair. That is a direction from the Mr Chair. You should probably ring a bell, Mr Chair.
All right, Grant Robertson.
I know it was so enlightening, Mr Chair, that you were gripped by my words. I understand that. Insomnia with his eyes open, Minister, but yes. And so in 58C3(2), we have a national planning standard that may include may direct local authorities to include specific provisions in their policy statements and plans. This is the very kind of overreach that we're talking about today, Mr Chair, where the Minister is taking powers that should and would lie in the hands of regional councils and using an instrument that he has called a template to do that. And, Mr Chair, that is actually not what the submitters who actually favoured this were looking for. And, in fact, they were quite clear in the concerns that they raised. A number of them, if we look down the opposition, so 77% opposed this implementation. The reasons for that included lack of evidence for a new planning instrument of this type. That came from district councils and iwi. And then erosion of local decision and democracy and decision-making. And that's exactly what this clause does. And just look at the groups, Mr Chair, who actually oppose this. The Stevenson Group, the Kaikoura District Council, Local Government New Zealand, the Resource Management Law Association, the PCE, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Genesis Energy and Fish and Game. You know, you'd hardly get all of those people in the room and all at once at the same time without some sort of barnyard brawl, and here they all are telling the Minister that he's overreaching again, that he's actually putting in place a measure that will erode local democracy and that will actually undermine the very premise of the RMA that decision-making should be, power should be held at the local level close to those who know how to solve the problems. And if the Minister gets up and tells me that this is about guidance, this is about making sure that there's consistency, that's what NPSs and NESs are about. That's the very purpose of those. And so for a piece of legislation that's allegedly here to make things easier and more effective and more efficient, it's just another layer. It's another layer. And it's so poorly developed that it's another layer that ends up with the same acronym as one of the layers that already exists. So now we've got two types of NPSs. We've got national policy statements and national planning standards and national environment standards. So it's some sort of weird hybrid morphed body of the two that's emerged out of the Select Committee as they try and clean up the mess that the Minister has created for them. So, Mr Chair, there are real concerns about the implementation of this template or standard. And I want to just mention the submission of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, because I think their submission actually sums up where the good could be in this, but where it goes off the rails. And they've said that a template, or now called a standard, should be limited to a pattern or plan format that identifies the plan format and layout, e-planning provisions including for both text and the associated planning maps, matters that the Council should address, provisions that must be included as a result of existing rules and plans and NPSs, and a glossary of terms. That's actually a useful set of things that will help guide and make more efficient and more effective the way in which plans work at the moment at a regional and local level. And they are very smart people from the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. But sadly, despite the best efforts of the Select Committee, we haven't actually seen sufficient changes to address those ideas. I just want to mention in the time that's remaining to me some further concerns around the implementation of the template, and in particular submitters who were very concerned about the amount of power that was given to the Minister to decide on template content, and submitters were particularly concerned that there was no requirement for a hearing and no avenues for appeal. Again, Mr Chair, this is just a good example of the way in which the Minister, if we give him credit, was trying to find a way to make the Act more effective and more efficient, has actually just ended up making it more complex, more difficult, has added a layer of uncertainty and confusion to the planning process. We could do so much better I think everybody in this House knows there are ways to improve the way that plans are drafted. There are the odd element in this bill that does that. Unfortunately, the national planning template could have been a good idea, but its implementation is deeply flawed.
Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take a quick call